Why the Whales Came. Chapter 10. Dawn Attack. I grieved that night as any child would who had just lost a father, but when I cried it was as much from guilt as from sorrow. From the moment I read the letter, I had little doubt in my mind that I had been the cause of my own father's death. It was I who had set foot on the forbidden island and brought the curse of Samson down on our heads. I lay awake beside mother all night long, trying to convince myself that there was at least a possibility it had not been all my fault. That after all, thousands of soldiers and sailors were dying in the war. But no matter how I reasoned, I could not get it out of my mind that it was I, and I alone, that had been responsible. Mother lay awake beside me like a statue that night, consumed by her own silent, private agony. She held my hand and squeezed it whenever I began to cry, but neither of us talked. I was tempted to confess everything, but I could not bring myself to do it. Anyway, I thought, there was no point in it, not now. It would not bring father back, and that was all she wanted. It was all I wanted. The day after the letter came was a wretched day of endless visitors. Friends and relatives from all over the islands came to pay their respects. They all brought little gifts, a posy of flowers or a pot of jam, and they all smiled sweetly, said how sad they were, and left as quietly as possible. Some on tiptoe as if they were in church. They were all of them kind, but it seemed to me as I stood behind mother's chair witnessing this procession that father's death had altered every one of them, for none of them really talked to us as they used to do. They made short, hushed speeches, their eyes lowered, and then they became impatient to leave. It was as if we had contracted some dreadful contagious disease. They were sympathetic, but they were keeping their distance just to be sure they would not catch it. Only Daniel's voluminous Auntie Mildred, the aunt who was forever kissing him, stayed to drink the cup of tea mother offered everyone. And she talked just as she always talked. She was the only one I remember who actually mentioned father. Of course, she went on, after first saying how sorry she was. Of course he was a fine man, your Peter. Good fisherman, brave man, but I always said he should never have left you and little Gracie like he did, to go off to the war. I told him so at the time. I said, Peter, you're too old to be going fighting wars at your age. There's plenty of younger ones should go first who haven't got wives and children. She sighed, sipping her tea daintily. But they never listen, do they, dear? They always think they know better, don't they? You can't tell them, can you? And when she got up to go several cups of tea later, it was already dark outside the window. She hugged me to her so long and so hard that she almost smothered me. Poor little mite, she said, kissing me on the head. Poor little mite. Anything I can do to help, you know where I am. And she was gone. When I shut the door behind her and turned round, I saw that mother was smiling. The grief lifted from her face for the first time that day. Thank God for Auntie Mildred, she said, and she closed her eyes and put her head back against the chair. It's a funny thing, Gracie, but I never liked that woman, not until now. Neither did your father, come to that. Then came a knock at the door. Someone else, Mother said. People are kind, Gracie. They're so kind, but I don't know if I can face anyone else. I'm tired. I'm so tired. Could be Daniel, I said. He hasn't been yet. But even as I was opening the door, I had the feeling it wasn't Daniel. The birdman stood there in the darkness. He smiled at me, but there was not a flicker of recognition in his face. And then Prince was jumping up at me and squeaking with excitement. The birdman and Mother looked at each other across the room. Mother had sat up in her chair and had her hand to her mouth. The birdman held out a pot of honey for her. Heard about your husband, he said. I heard what happened. I've come to tell you I'm sorry. Believe me, Mrs. Jenkins, I'm so sorry. It's Mr. Woodcock, isn't it? Said Mother, rising from her chair and taking the honey from him. And I think I have more to thank you for than just this one pot of honey, haven't I? It was you, wasn't it? It was you all along. You were the one who's been so kind to Gracie and me all this time. But the birdman was already walking out of the door, Prince following at his heels. Mr. Woodcock, Mother called out after him. I've a cup of tea for you. It's still warm. But the birdman never looked round. He disappeared down the path and into the darkness. Well, Mother said, so now we know who it was. But why, Gracie? I don't understand it. I've never even spoken to him before this evening. Worse than that, I've avoided him all my life, and father always kept well out of his way too. She was looking directly at me now, the honey still in her hand. He speaks so strangely. It may only have been the way he talks, but I felt that he meant what he said, more than anyone else today. It was almost as if he felt responsible somehow, as if he was apologising. To my great relief, Mother said no more about it until we were in bed later that night. I've been thinking, she said, about that dog, the Birdman's dog. Have you ever seen that dog before, Gracie? Have you? He certainly looked as if he knew you, jumping all over you like that, just like you were old friends. Gracie? Gracie? But it was as fast asleep as I could pretend to be. But I was as fast asleep as I could pretend to be. My breathing so deep and regular that pretense must have given way to fatigue, and I was soon well and truly asleep. I woke up suddenly. I thought at first it might be a gull tapping on the window, but when I looked there was nothing there. The night sky was already grey with morning. I could see the branches of the tamarisk tree outside my window, shaking in the wind, but there was no gale blowing, and it was only a gale that the twigs scraped against the window pane. I sat up in bed slowly so as not to wake Mother, who lay on her side facing away from me. Then I heard it again, and this time I knew it for what it was, for I heard the pebble fall back and bounce on the path outside. I eased myself carefully out of the bed and crept over to the window. Daniel stood on the path looking up at me, and he was beckoning me to come down. I dressed quickly at the bottom of the stairs, wrapped myself against the cold of the morning, and stole out of the house. Daniel said nothing. He put a finger to his lips to prevent me from whispering. We stole down the path and out of the gate, and then we began to run. We ran all the way up to the top of Samson Hill before we stopped to rest. I looked across to the Birdman's cottage, but everything was dark on Heathy Hill. I flung myself down exhausted in the heather, and Daniel crouched down beside me. Won't help saying anything, I don't suppose, he said, but I am sorry, Gracie. Honest I am. It was the curse of Samson, wasn't it? I said, and he nodded. My father's dead, and all because we went on that island, isn't he? It's all true, isn't it? The Birdman told me everything, Daniel said, but it's not his fault, Gracie, and it's not your fault. He's done all he could. What do you mean? Tell you later, Gracie. There's no time now. We've got to warn him. We've got to warn him quick. Warn him? I asked. It's Big Tim and his crowd, Daniel went on. I heard them planning it. Dawn attack, they called it. You remember what we said at school? You remember what he said at school, don't you? Well, Big Tim went and told Father, just like he said he was going to. He told him I'd been over to see the Birdman and all that tommy rot about the Birdman being a spy and signalling to German submarines. Of course, Father believed him. Father always believes everything he says. He struck me again and then shut me in my room. That was Big Tim's idea, so I wouldn't be able to warn the Birdman they were coming to search his cottage. And they did come. Police from St. Mary's yesterday afternoon. I heard them talking to Father outside the window when they came back from the Birdman's cottage. Of course, they didn't find anything, and they were angry. They told Father not to waste their time in future. Said they'd better things to do than go visiting madmen. A lot of silly nonsense, they said. How could anyone think that a mad old fool like that could be a spy? Didn't even understand the questions they asked him. All he'd do was smile and nod his head. Couldn't even speak properly, they said. So anyway, when they left, Father turned on Big Tim and gave him a piece of his mind for making him look a fool. They let me out at tea time and I went over to see the Birdman straight away to tell him about your father. He was so upset, Gracie. Said he had to go and see you and your mother. I tried to stop him, but he had to go, he said. He had to see your mother and tell her face to face how sorry he was. Blames himself, see? I warned him you'd be in trouble if he looked as if he recognised you in front of your mother. I told him he mustn't recognise you. Prince did, I said. Leapt up on me, he did, just like he always does. Mother knows something's up, I think, but she's not sure what. I think she's too tired to care. You could have warned me, I went on. You could have warned me he was coming, couldn't you? I was going to, Gracie, Daniel said. I was on my way back from Heathy Hill to tell you he was coming, and then I heard him. Who? Big Tim and everyone, like I told you. Must have been a dozen of them in there, outside the boat shed, and I could hear Big Tim planning this dawn attack, just like he was a general or something. He said they should never have sent out the police to question the Birdman. They should have sent the Navy, he said. They'd have got the truth out of him. He said he knew the truth anyway. The Birdman was a spy, had to be. And of course, they all agreed. If no one else would do it, then he'd do it himself. He was going to teach the Birdman a lesson. The last thing he said was that they'd meet at dawn and ransack his cottage. They wanted to drive him off the island forever, Gracie. Didn't anyone try to stop him? I asked. No one argues with Big Tim. You know that. They're all frightened of him, Daniel said. So that's why we've got to get there first whilst there's still time. We've got to warn him, Gracie. And he pulled me to my feet again, and we began to rush down towards Rushy Bay and up over the dunes towards the Birdman's cottage. Already there was a glimmer of daylight creeping over the sea. When we got there, the cottage was quite empty. The two goats came to nuzzle us as we searched outside, and it was then that Daniel noticed that the cart was not in its usual place. He's off collecting wood somewhere, I expect, he said. Popplestones or Hell Bay. We've got to find him. We were passing the pool under Gweel Hill when I happened to look over my shoulder and saw them, shadowy figures against the skyline, flitting through the undergrowth high on Samson Hill. It's them, they're coming, I said. What can we do? Nothing, said Daniel, taking my arm and pulling me on. It's too late, and there's too many of them. We ran on down towards Popplestones. The donkey and cart were by the rocks at the far end of the beach, moving from time to time as the donkey browsed along the line of seaweed, and for a moment there was all we could make out, until we heard Prince barking. We could see the Birdman now, standing in the shadows. A flock of gulls lifted off the water and circled, shrieking overhead. Then we saw a long, dark shape lying at the water's edge, and the Birdman kneeling in the water beside it. As we ran across the sand, we could see he was trying to roll it over, and that it was clearly too big for him to move. It could have been mistaken for a great log, but for the fact that it moved of its own accord. It had a huge fan-shaped tail that lifted and fell, slapping the water as we came towards it. The Birdman heaved again, and the creature writhed once more and lifted its head. Until that moment, the horn had been camouflaged from us, because it was almost the same colour as the sand. The creature, whatever it was, possessed a long, pointed horn that protruded from just below the dome of its blunt black head. It was only when we came closer that we saw how vast the creature was. From tail to head, it was the length of a small boat, perhaps 15 feet, and the horn itself half as long again. It looked more like a whale than anything else. The fine, tapering horn seemed an unnatural and incongruous addition to the clumsy bulk of its body. The horn, Daniel, I said. It's just like the horn we found in that cottage on Samson, isn't it? It's just like he told me, Daniel said quietly. It's just like the Birdman told me. What do you mean? I asked, but Daniel was running on ahead of me. The Birdman got slowly to his feet as he saw us coming. Prince had stopped barking and growling and was bounding up the beach towards us. Thank God you've come, the Birdman called out. I can't do it on my own, not strong enough. Been here all night trying to roll her back into the sea, but she's too heavy for me. What is it? I asked, rushing out to touch it, and then not daring to do so. It was speckled black all over, but darker along the ridge of the back than anywhere else. Daniel pulled at the Birdman's sou'wester so that he should turn and look at him while he was speaking. It's like the ones they killed on Samson, isn't it? Daniel asked. It's the same, isn't it, Mr. Woodcock? Just the same, he said. It was me that found the first one that day too. And he looked out to sea. The others will be out there at sea just like they were before, and they'll come in just as they did before. They think they can help, you see, but they can't. We've got to get her back in the water before they come, else they'll beach themselves just the same. We've got to do it before anyone comes, I tell you. If they find her here, that'll be the end of Briar. It will happen all over again. What will? I shouted. What's going on? What are you talking about? I don't understand what's happening. Please tell me, please. I was crying now, out of grief and bewilderment, out of anger and frustration. The Birdman looked down at me and spoke more softly and clearly than I had ever heard him speak. After what happened to your poor father, said the Birdman, you have more right to know about the curse of Samson than anyone else, and you shall know, but I haven't got much time to tell you, so listen well, Gracie. It was all a long, long time ago. but I remember it as if it were yesterday. Samson was always a poor place when I was a boy. Little enough food to go round, and life was hard. But we survived well enough until the day the whales came. I found the first of them lying on the beach early one morning, crying out for help. Mother and I tried to roll it back into the sea, but we couldn't move it. The whale shifted again on the sand, and the birdman looked around. Just like that one, just the same, he said. And by daybreak, the whole island was there. But they wouldn't help us, not even Father. And do you know why not? I shook my head. Well, I'll tell you, Gracie. You see, there were more whales out in the bay, and the more the stranded whale cried out, the closer the others came to the beach. The people only had to wait, and they knew it. By noon, all the whales were stranded on the sand, calling out to each other, crying pitifully. Mother begged them not to do it. I begged them not to do it, but it was no good. They had all made up their minds. They said there was enough ivory in the horns to make us all rich for life. So they butchered them on the beach in the sunshine, and the blood stained the sand and ran out into the sea. The sea was redder that evening than any sunset I've ever seen. The very next morning, Gracie, we woke up to find a ship out in the bay, stuck fast on a sandbank. The ghost ship, I said. The ghost ship Father told me about. Ghost ship? The birdman said. Maybe it was. It was deserted, that's for sure. Not a soul on board. They couldn't believe their luck. Ivory one day and a fine ship for the salvage the next. They floated her off the sandbank on the morning tide and sailed for Penzance. Every man on the island went, Father too. And they took the horns with them to sell on the mainland, all except one. We found it later, Mother and me, half buried in the sand. That's the one we found over on Samson, Daniel said. The birdman went on, hardly pausing for breath. They none of them came back. I never saw Father again. The ship went down with all hands. Every man on Samson was gone. Mother said the island was cursed because they had massacred the whales. But no one believed her. They said she was mad. And they didn't believe her in the years that followed when ship after ship was wrecked on the rocks off Samson. Over 50 people have died in those wrecks, Gracie. Even the few that crawled ashore never survived. Everyone said it was just bad luck, but Mother and I knew it was the curse. When the hunger came and the disease, we knew what it was, and still no one believed us. All we had to eat were limpets and a few wild rabbits. Did you eat the dogs? I asked. Father said you had to eat the dogs. The birdman nodded. When you're starving, you eat anything, he said. One by one, the other families left. For 2 years, Mother and I lived alone on the island. Mother wouldn't leave. She didn't want to leave Father's ghost on the island. She said she owed it to him to stay. We would never have left it at all if the well hadn't gone dry. Never failed before that well. Wet summer it was too. No, it was the curse that dried that well, Gracie. It was the curse that drove us off the island. The birdman looked up towards the black hills of Samson in the distance. All my life I've tried to lift the curse. All my life I've tried to keep everyone away from Samson. That's why I row out there whenever there's a storm threatening, whenever I see the fog rolling in. It's to light a beacon on the cliff top to warn the ships to keep away. So it was you, I said. It was you over on Samson that night Daniel and I got lost in the fog. Yes, it was me, he said sadly. And I wish to heaven I'd never done it. It was my fire that drew you to Samson, Gracie, and brought the curse down on you. And now your poor father's dead. At that moment, we heard the first blood-curdling yell up on Heathy Hill behind us. We turned round. Look, Daniel said, pointing up towards the hillside, where we could just make out Big Tim's soldiers moving like shadows through the dark of the heather for their dawn attack on the birdman's cottage. We saw the goats bolting up the hillside, bleating in terror, and then came the sound of the squawking hens and crashing glass. We're too late, Gracie, Daniel said. We came to warn you, Mr. Woodcock. It's Big Tim and his friends. Like I told you, he thinks you're signalling to German submarines. Thinks you're a spy or something. Spy? The birdman did not seem to know what the word meant. He seemed more hurt and puzzled than angry. It doesn't matter anyway, he said, turning away. All that matters now is the whale. She must not be allowed to die. She must not. The tide is already on the ebb, so if we don't get her back in the water soon, it'll be too far to drag her, and then it'll be too late. They're inside the cottage now, Mr. Woodcock, Daniel said. I can't see any of them outside anymore. Let's hope they stay inside, the birdman said. It's getting lighter all the time. If they see us here, I'm afraid that'll be the end of it, just like it was on Samson when the whales came before. However hard we pushed and shoved, the whale always rolled back to where it came from. Daniel and I tried to ignore the sounds of destruction coming from the cottage as we threw ourselves time and time against the side of the whale. Desperately, we dug the sand away from one side and tried to roll it over, but it would only go so far before the fin on the far side would push it back towards us again. All we managed to do, it seemed, was to make matters worse, for the whale now lay half buried in a deep trough of wet sand, and all the time the tide was taking the sea away from us. We sat back to regain our strength and to take stock of what could be done. We knew it was useless to try again, but we steeled ourselves for one last attempt. Kneeling in the sand, our shoulders against the side of the whale, we heaved together, once, twice, and then felt the great weight of the creature falling back on us. As it came back, it fell heavily into its ditch in the sand, almost trapping my arm underneath it. I was sitting breathless in the sand when I heard Big Tim's voice behind us. What have you got there? They were coming towards us across the beach. Look at the size of it, one of them said. And they stopped several yards away from us. Big Tim was the next to speak. Well, what is it? He asked. It's a whale, said Daniel. And we've got to get it back into the sea before it dies. We've got to, because if it dies, the birdman says we'll be cursed on Briar, just like they were on Samson. You got to help us, Tim. If you all help, we can roll it back easy. The birdman says, Big Tim mimicked, and his friends laughed in unison around him. The birdman says, he's a Hun lover. Gracie, I told you. Gracie, he signals to German submarines, maybe to the very one that killed your father. Well, we've broken every window in this cottage. We've pulled down his hen house, and there's a few of those wooden birds that won't fly again. And if he stays, we'll be back again. And then it won't be just his windows will break. It will be him. Do you hear that, you mad old fool? You clear out. You're not wanted on this island. The birdman got slowly to his feet and limped towards Big Tim. Prince followed, growling at his heels. As he came towards them, Big Tim and his friends backed away. You must be Big Tim, he said. I think I recognise you. Daniel told me all about you. I tell you, if we do not get this creature back into the sea before she dies, this island will die like Samson did. Do you hear me? Do you understand what I'm telling you? If you love your island, help us while there is still time. Help you, said Big Tim, still backing away. Why should we help you after what you've done? Anyway, that whale or whatever it is doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us. If you want it for yourself, you'll have to drag it up above high water mark, and you're too old and feeble to do that, aren't you? And these two aren't much use, are they? So it's ours, as much as it's yours, all of ours, isn't it? It's no different to the timber washed up last year. We shared it, didn't we? Everyone shared it. That's worth a bit too, by the look of it. I've never seen a fish that big, and I've seen some big ones. Some monster of a fish. That horn's worth something too. I shouldn't wonder. You can't kill her, cried Daniel, appealing not to Big Tim now, but to his friends. You can't let him do it. You heard what the birdman said. It's all true, and I know him. He's a good man. He's not a spy like Big Tim says. Why should he lie? Can't you see he's trying to save us? But they were not listening. None of them were. They were staring out over the sea, a look of utter astonishment on every face. There was nothing there but the sound at first, a curious roaring and crying from the open sea beyond Popplestones that became a crescendo of thunderous snorting and whistling. Within minutes, Popplestones was alive with whales. Great spouts of water shot into the air. Everywhere you looked in the bay, shining black backs broke the surface, rocked a little, and then rolled forward and vanished again under the water. All of Big Tim's friends had already fled up the beach, but he stayed with us, as mesmerised as we were. Beside us, the stranded whale writhed and rolled in its grave of sand, its tail thrashing in fury and frustration. Its own whistling cry joined the chorus of the others out in Popplestones. They've come, cried the birdman. It's too late, too late. What a catch, shouted Big Tim. What a catch. There must be dozens of them out there. Can't do it on our own, though. We'll need help. I'm going back for help. And he ran up the beach to join his friends. We're going. We'll be back and we'll kill every one of them, Birdman. What does he say? The birdman asked Daniel. I don't understand what he's saying. Is he going for help? I can't see what he's saying. He talks too fast for me. Is he going for help? No, said Daniel. He's going to fetch the whole island down here. But they won't be coming to help. They'll be coming to kill Mr. Woodcock. And we can't stop them. There'll be too many of them. Not again, said the Birdman. Oh, please, God, not again. We have to stop them. We have to stop them.